Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. My turn again while Bobby takes a break. And this week I'm going to chat with a couple of dear friends. James Fulford-Talbot, who has been a previous guest, and Jodie Fulford-Talbot, a fellow female veteran, radical candour practitioner and wine sister. In the spirit of owning your own fuck-ups, I confess I made the unforgivable error of introducing Jodie as James's wife, and she was quite rightly very pissed off with me. I think I'm forgiven now. Anyway, as two veterans with wide experience of the corporate hustle in both the UK and Australia, they're going to share some insights from their favourite episodes. So come and have a listen to Guests with Gifts. So welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. I have two wonderful guests with me today because I am flying solo for these mini episodes where we're inviting listeners to come and talk to us. And this time we have the two J's, the lovely Jodie and James Fulford-Talbot. Now you might remember that James was a guest in our season 1, so he very graciously agreed to be a guinea pig when this podcast was very young. So you may remember him, and we have his lovely wife, Jodie, coming to talk to us. So who gets to go first out of this husband and wife duo?
Well, obviously I'm a wife, so it's been mentioned a few times, but that's not my full-time job. I know Bridget from our time in the army together, and I'm now moved from the UK about 15 years ago to live in Australia, and I live and work in Australia now in the countryside, which I think has been an interesting move. We moved since COVID, so now I'm working back in the city 2 or 3 days a week to keep my brain alive.
So I'm the husband, James, and obviously I live where Jodie lives. I met Jodie in the forces and then met you shortly after that, Bridget. And the only sort of relevant thing I think to mention that Jodie hasn't is that in the country we live with two miniature donkeys, Freddie and Mr. Percival, and we go to the pub with them.
Oh yes, I think the donkeys might be more famous than both of you.
They are.
Definitely. They're being interviewed this weekend.
Do you either of you get to actually speak, or is it just the donkeys? Do you have a donkey that you speak for? Jodie, do you speak for one donkey and James, you speak for the other, or does it get mixed up?
We actually do sort of, so I always walk Freddie and James always walks Mr. Percival.
Maybe we can share the link of the interview so that anyone who's listening can find out a little bit more about the famous donkeys, Mr. Percival and Freddie. Okay, what got you listening to More Than a Lumpy Jumper?
I'm happy to start on that one. I mean, it was you, Bridget. I've known you for ages, and when I knew you were doing something, I didn't really know Bobby. I'd heard of her, but I wanted to listen to it to support you. That was the original reason, but I'm obviously continue to listen for other reasons, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Mine is similar, and I'm actually not a podcast listener. James has a radio on, has noise on all the time. I'm not. I work and I think can do everything in silence. So when I first listened, it was, again, because of you, Bridge, because to sport. And then I suppose what that morphed into, while I wasn't necessarily always listening, I did share it. I was doing quite a lot of work in the DEI space earlier this year and the end of last year at work. And I was sharing it with a lot of the females across the business as a good thing to listen to and learn. And then more recently, I've started jogging and I've been trying to go a bit further. And the last probably 3 or 4 times I've been jogging, doing a slightly longer distances, learning from James, I've actually put the podcast on and it's fantastic for jogging too. So that's the why I'm keep listening. It's literally so much better than music, so much better than being in my own head. So I'm sort of listening and chortling along and puffing and panting. So I think people jogging past me will be saying I'm some sort of weird mad lady because I am puffing and panting, sweating and occasionally sniggering. So started because of you, but actually it's really useful asset, I think, for people who haven't had the same sort of backgrounds as we have, but I'm really enjoying it because it keeps me occupied and keeps my mind off my running.
And just to follow up on why I keep listening is I appreciate the fact that you two have both, been in the trenches, you're practitioners of this stuff. It's not about concepts. It's about, how leadership and some of these challenges of team behavior actually work. So I enjoy that. I also enjoy the lightness that you two bring to the podcast. It's good fun. I laugh at it as well as learning a lot of practical things. And the final thing is that there's a lot of white men in pairs on the radio, so it's nice to hear opinions from two talented women as opposed to stale old white men.
In grey suits.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that we were hoping to do was to challenge a little bit about the fact that so many podcasts were very male and also American. I think that we wanted to bring maybe a little bit more levity or not quite so much seriousness and earnestness into some of the discussions about leadership. And I think also just a bit about the frailty of humanity and the fact that quite a lot of stuff you listen to is very aspirational, but often leaves certainly me feeling a little bit inadequate because I was sitting there going, God, I never do that. Oh yeah, I failed at that. And so I think that we wanted to bring it down to be a little bit more accessible to people. So it felt a little bit more real. So yay. Okay. So you are listening, and I'm Jodie. I'm super, super happy that we've got another reason for people to listen to More Than a Lumpy Jumper, which is to help with jogging. That one hasn't come up so far. And so yeah, we're great. I might even try it myself. Favorite episode and why?
Jodie, I'm going to go in this one because I was really surprised. I was out the other day and it just flicked over onto one, and I was jogging and I'm not very capable at doing things on my iPod when I am, and it was the one about spirituality with a lady vicar.
Alison Riley, yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, I've got 7 Ks to go. And actually it was fascinating. It was really interesting because I'm an avowed atheist. But what I really liked was it didn't turn out to be about God or even spirituality too deeply. It was about humanity. And I loved the sort of camaraderie, the sharing stories, the different opinions, the learnings. And it was 3 very different points of view, 3 very different sort of life journeys. And it was a really interesting conversation. Some of it was actually quite humbling, some of the stuff that was being talked about. And yeah, very new points of view for me in a place I would have never normally, like if I hadn't been running, I would have flicked ahead. So being made to stay and listen to it, and I actually got a lot out of it. It was great.
One of my favourite episodes as well, actually, because Alison was at Sandhurst with me and Bobby, and she always was a really interesting character, very calm. When I found out that she'd become a vicar, I don't know that it was one of those, holy crap, it's not like if I told people that I'd become a vicar, I think a lot of people would be like, what the fuck? But for Alison, it was a bit like, oh yeah, okay, I can kind of see that. I have to say, I love listening to her voice. She's got the most beautiful voice for radio. I'm really tempted to try and pitch her for Thought for the Day or something on Radio 4, because I've kind of, if Thought for the Day still happens, because I think that she has this really beautiful outlook. And I too found it quite humbling to listen to some of the things that she does and the way she approaches things. I thought that it was really, really lovely. So I'm glad that you enjoyed that episode.
Am I allowed to do one more, which is a quick one? Yep. And it sort of comes back to that sort of point of difference, because there was another one where I think you had Wendy Folks and somebody else on. There were 4 of you. And again, I really like the camaraderie in the chats. But actually, the amount people are willing to share seems unusual as well. People have been very, very open and very, very honest. So you're obviously creating a sort of a safe space for people who are coming on. And I really enjoy listening to that sort of exchange of ideas, and the people feel comfortable enough to have very, very open conversations on a podcast. I wouldn't have thought that's normal. It's quite unusual.
Thanks. A couple of people have mentioned that, and I think it may be both Bobby and I are also quite honest and vulnerable. Sometimes we talk about things that maybe we wouldn't have thought we would. Certainly on the episode with James, when we were talking about my time in Gaza and the things that led up to my burnout, I think it got to a point where when I was listening to it again, when I was editing, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't quite believe that I sort of opened up in that way. And so yeah, I think that it helps that we are willing to to open up as well. I think that people then feel more comfortable to do so. I think it's also, though, an element that of, to be honest, the majority of people that have come on as guests have been people that we know and love us. So there is already an element of trust in terms of that. So yeah. Anyway, but thank you for noticing.
And for me, I really enjoyed the episode on curiosity and being vulnerable. It's funny, actually, you were talking about all the things that you've, realised that didn't go well, well in the past. And, we can all talk about those things that didn't go well in the past in our leadership experience. And I guess the reason I liked it is because so many of the leaders and senior people that I work with feel that they need to be perfect and to have to know the answers, and to lead is to be that center of power and excellence, I guess. And the concept of always being curious, always being prepared to learn, and being open to learn, I think is something that everybody needs to do. And it's funny, in the military, we always ask others for advice. We always ask other people for their perspective, because we're in complex environments and fast-moving environments, and we know we haven't got the answer. But I even see military people that are not in military circumstances not wanting to ask for help, not wanting to try new things. And so I really enjoyed the way that you brought the need to be vulnerable out. And I think also you had a good chat about Bobby and her suspenders. I think that was that episode as well. So that made me chuckle, because I can imagine the fear in the colour sergeant's eyes. And yes, no,
Jodie, if you haven't heard this episode, this was quite early on, and we were talking about show parades and some of the sort of jolly japes that we got up to, and one of which was Bobby basically doing a malicious compliance. She did some malicious compliance in terms of the show parade that she was told to do, which was show same coloured stockings. And so you can imagine how she turned up, but with the MAC on top, and the colour song curtailed the show parade just before she undid the MAC, because you think he thought he was going to be fired if he did. But everybody turned out to watch the show parade. And so, yeah, it was, I also now in hindsight feel somewhat sorry for the guy, because we all put him in quite a sort of difficult position. Well, we had that conversation actually when Wendy and Sal were on, about whether or not those japes would still be possible at Santos, and I honestly don't know. I'd love to hear from someone who's at Santos now to find out whether or not those sort of show parades sort of silliness, because I'm sure, there was loads of it, all kinds of silliness, but not necessarily with suspenders, but all kinds of other silliness. And I just wonder whether they're able to do that now. So is there anything that you have taken away from the podcast that you have found useful to use in either life or in your work?
Which there's nothing specifically I want to call out. I just want to call out the fact that quite often in the Nexus team, we'll talk about them after we've listened to them. And, sometimes it reinforces the kind of things that we do, but you're always bringing currency and relevancy and a little bit of depth to the conversation. So it's just been a great way of reconsidering and discussing some of the challenges we come across in our teams. So nothing specific, more general discussion starter.
Thanks. I think there's an episode that went out a couple of weeks ago with Danny, who said that a similar thing, that effectively sometimes it just makes her feel seen, in the fact that it's reinforcing things that she's doing that sometimes she's finding quite difficult, but it reinforces to her that she's not crazy, she's not alone, she's not the only person who thinks that way. And so for her, it's a way of just feeling seen. And so, yeah, I think that sometimes I don't know that we recreate the wheel in the podcast. We're not coming up with any particularly new ideas, but I think that sometimes just doing things that everyone goes, yeah, well, I knew that already. So, did you? Are you doing it? It can be just a reminder for us to focus on things or just encourage us to.
And I think as well, from sort of just building on that, it's a useful resource to me to share with people when you are doing, like the DEI stuff or having conversations with people about certain things. And it's actually another handy resource to share. But personally, again, while I may not be learning anything, I'm taking time to think about things that I wouldn't normally take time to think about. So it's, there is nothing new under the sun and we're all old. But there's times when you're just so busy, I suppose, doing things. There's things that you do know, but you just don't give yourself time to think about or consider or whatever. So it's nice to have a different point of view, but also to have the time to hear those points of view and to let it sink in. And then you'll sort of keep mulling about it for a while afterwards until the next shiny thing comes along. But it's interesting conversations and thought-provoking.
And on that topic, are there any topics that you would like us to tackle in the future? Because at the moment we're planning for season 4, I think. And so, is there anything where you've sat there and gone, or when you've been having your discussions, James, at work, or feedback from people that you've shared with Jodie, that you think, it would be kind of cool if you did this?
So, and I haven't listened to them all. So, and you've covered quite a few things. So, it's, if I'm saying something that you've already covered, forgive me. But there's a couple of things that spring to mind for me. One is, how leaders lead a strategy and strategic implementation, because it's something that 70% of organisations fail at, and getting that flow down and getting the buy-in from organisations to actually deliver on the complex stuff and move away from that highly gratifying churn of a business and finding the space to work on the strategic outcomes would be certainly one of the things I think would be interesting to hear other people's opinions on about the challenges.
In 44 minutes.
In 44 minutes. And the other one, I know you've touched on this, but it's really diving into that psychological safety space and how you really get teams to lean into issues, and particularly trying to get from the standard organizations that execute into truly an organization that learns and is constantly learning and is constantly going through that spiral of what we can do better, and having a leadership mentality that encourages that organization for learning rather than execution.
I suppose that's sort of bigger picture stuff. And one of the things that I find that whenever I talk to sort of, especially women, about what they don't understand and know how to do, it's really simple things like personal branding. The amount of people I've had talk about branding and how you stand out, how you define yourself, what personal branding actually is a big one. Influencing and negotiating. Not everybody, so many people hate networking. So how do you actually create a network? How do you go out there? What does that look like? Because I know you've both sort of had lots of different experience in lots of different places, and I'm sure you've come across this so many times. So it's that sort of practical tips is the sort of thing that I think we get asked a lot for. And then I suppose it is about that positioning yourself as a female in the workplace and how to take advantage of our secret strengths and not get caught up in all the sort of male dominated things, but really getting ahead as a female leader. In fact, James and I were briefly talking about that the other day, about the sort of difference between sort of lots of females of my era, we've been taught to lead as men because there's never any other way. And, it's still default positions in front side of it. So that sort of difference between how leadership is evolving for females, I think, is interesting. And then the other thing, because I get hung up on it all the time and get really annoyed with people about it, is the difference between management and leadership, because not everybody can or will be or needs to be a leader. But if people don't manage properly, leadership is obviously often less useful. So it's that balance between leading and managing, I think, would be a really practical session that you'd bring a lot of value and insights to.
Love those. I have to say that both Bobby and I have been grappling with the branding issue, and it has been fascinating. I think we've both been engaged with sort of professionals who advise on it. And actually, when you start to get down into it and talking about values, but also difference between maybe a personal brand and an organizational brand, and if you're a sole trader, whether you keep those separate and how you keep them separate has been really fascinating. So that would be an awesome episode to record, I think, and one that we could both bring something to because we both experienced it personally. Yeah, and you know, the network issue about what that looks like. And for me, you and I have very similar approaches in terms of this idea of the difference, you know, this idea of leadership and whether it's male or female. And it's the same, you know, having been told so often, you know, be yourself, stop trying to be a guy in leadership. And having been told that quite an early stage in my career, I was really lucky to sort of have to face up to that and be told that by a man has really directed my approach. And this idea of some of the sort of older style leadership traits, which are viewed as masculine, but actually so many men I know are already really good at what we call the feminine traits or the soft skills. And I think that really there just needs to be a wholehearted change in this. Or maybe I think we need to look very hard at the language we're using and the assumptions that we have behind them to check that we're talking about the same thing. Because when one person talks about leadership and hard skills and another person talks about leadership and soft skills, they may well be talking about different styles of leadership and not really sort of gelling or not really talking about the same thing. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation that we all need to have, and we need to have it a lot.
I think there's also a generational shift coming or been that I'm on the wrong side of, but you know, you can see people having now working or leading in different styles, and there is a generational shift. It's how do you work across that?
Yeah, and that was something that was brought up a couple of weeks ago by Danny and Joe, and also we've talked to Alison about the different languages that the generations use and how we understand each other. It's so important because, as we all know, basically Generation Z are going to be the leaders at some point, and not in not the too distant future, in our decrepitude, are going to be the people in charge. And so how do we make sure that they don't just kind of throw us out the window because we are all just talking a different language? So yeah, I found that really interesting. I think we're going to do an episode on young leaders and how they are developing. So in a similar way to a thing about how women are positioning themselves in the workplace, how younger leaders are positioning themselves in the workplace, I think is going to be super interesting. Okay, and then finally, nomination of 3 people that you would like to listen to the podcast.
So I was thinking about people that I know are fascinated by the subject of leadership. And so there's David Thompson, who I used to work with in a previous life and took over the GM role for me. There's Alison Rebus, who's a woman we know very well, who I've been working with her team. And then finally, John Fawcett, who's a senior program guy in Suncor and who is, again, very skilled and interested in the subject of leadership.
And I'm going with Kate Stewart, who I worked with closely at my current job, but she's now moved roles and lives in Canberra. Pip Horton, who's a friend of mine, she's thinking about what comes next as a career. So I think that's a great time. And I'm going to hold off the other one because I'm starting a new job tomorrow. So I'm going to see who is in my new cohort, because I'm going to university. So I think there'll be lots of interest and a lot of synergy. So I'll see who I can find at UNSW that might be interesting to new audience members.
Thank you so much. And before we go, I owe Jodie a massive apology for describing her as a wife. And I should know better as a feminist and as her friend. So apologies, Jodie. So Wendy Foe, who did a photo exhibition called Not Just a Wife, and it was based on her discussions with people finding out that actually so many military spouses were doing far more interesting things than their spouses.
I was the world's worst army wife for about 15 minutes. It was dreadful.
Yeah,
I recall.
I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
I recall.
I knew what I was getting into, though.
I couldn't go into the camp because they wanted me to have a dependence card, and I refused because I'm an independent.
Yes, we could have a whole other episode on language. So my sincere apologies, my darling Jodie. I don't know what I was thinking.
Not at all, Mrs. Mo.
Anyway, thank you so much, both of you. It's been a really, really interesting episode. I can't wait to edit it, even though I'm not going to edit out my idiocy. I will leave that in for all to see in the spirit of vulnerability. So thank you so much, and take care. I'll speak to you soon.
See you soon, Reg. Bye.
Thanks for listening. We have quite a back catalogue of topics now, so if you're struggling with an issue, maybe check through our episodes to see if there's anything to help and inspire you. And if you do enjoy the podcast, there's still time to vote for us in the British Podcast Awards. Next week, we're back with Bobby for more guests with gifts. See you then.